Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm going to do a further video today on PTSD. I've made a few of these videos now for antibiotic induced trauma. There's 2 other videos on my channel. This will be the 3rd that I'm making. The other videos are more descriptive of symptoms of PTSD. This one is going to sort of elaborate on all that and try to translate what all these symptoms mean in terms of the changes made to the hardware upstairs here in the hippocampus and amygdala and prefrontal cortex areas, and what that actually translates into in terms of everyday events and personality. So I want to start by saying that post-traumatic stress disorder is described as an anxiety disorder that develops in reaction to physical injury and or severe mental or emotional distress. So physical injury or severe mental or emotional distress. I think that they designate or distinguish mental and emotional rather than just calling it something like consciousness, because the mental leans more towards the cognitive and thought, trying to ration and reason your way through something and you just can't do it, and it's extremely distressing from thoughts, versus the emotional response to it, which is extremely negatively arousing through fear and pain and anger. This event, for most of us who had these reactions to Cipro, was, these events were, in my case, it was all 3. I was severely physically injured, and I was severely mentally and emotionally distressed. So I was completely wrecked in body, spirit, and mind. Some people suffered more cognitive or emotional, psychiatric. Some people more physical. Some of us got a strong dose of the whole thing. So this is really no different than someone who suffers some kind of an injury in a combat situation, a plane crash, a violent crime. We're talking about the same response by the brain to this catastrophic event, because it changes everything that you were up to that point as far as how your brain is wired and your old patterns and how you used to function. It's a very rapid change, right? So I want to use this word here, reorder. And in the last video that I made when I talked about PTSD, I described how the brain rewires itself. It essentially makes shortcuts as it goes into survival mode, because it's just too much for our hardware to process as it normally functions. So the brain will immediately rapidly change its neural and sensory networks and reorder itself in order to adapt to the new condition. In a trauma response, which the designation for post-traumatic stress is that it's prolonged. It's after 4 weeks. I'm at about 9 months now. Things are getting better, but looking back now, I can clearly see, and still today, that there was a post-traumatic stress result in my brain. And if any of this resonates with you, I would encourage you to explore this further, potentially seek treatment for it. Good luck with that. So let's continue. So when it reorders and the brain is in survival mode, the prefrontal cortex, I've made some notes here, the prefrontal cortex is not getting the information that it did previously, can't get information fast enough. That's the area of the brain up here in the front that's responsible for executive functioning, concentration, and memory, and inhibition and thought. The part that makes us human and able to reason and think is the prefrontal cortex area. So when the brain rewires, it sort of cuts that part out, not entirely, but much more than it had been in the past, because it's really more of an emotional or lower state of survival. So that part of our brain is, resources are pulled away from it. So also there are changes to the hippocampus, and this is the structure in the brain that is associated with short-term memory. So I know, at least for the first several months, and still yet, sometimes I notice that my memory is not what it used to be. And like I'll put my keys down and leave the room, and then literally 10 seconds later, I can't remember where the hell I just put my keys, right? Or did you, you know, did you leave the car door open when you come in the house? Now, it seems mundane enough, but if this is like routine stuff and you remember yourself from before, and these were not things that you did before, you had done before, there's a possibility that the stress response and the reordering as a result of that has had an effect on your short-term memory. Um, so we got the prefrontal cortex is kind of routed out of the equation. We've got the hippocampus is um, shortened a bit, and that has an effect on our short-term memory. And then the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for sensory acquisition and kind of routing that information into the body and into the glands, the endocrine system, the limbic system. So the amygdala will be on alert and grabbing a hold of all the sensory information and kind of hoarding it quickly, and then sending out information to your glands, such as the adrenal glands, pituitary glands, that there's a lot of stress in your environment and that your body needs to dump cortisone, glucose, norepinephrine, stress response hormones into the body as a result. So this is like a hyper-aroused state of consciousness, explained in terms of neuroanatomy. Once these stress hormones are dumped into the body, the entire stress response system gradually becomes, with this condition, sensitized through the reordering. So this is sort of a more elaborate description of what rewiring or reordering means. We're literally being rewired into a survival state of consciousness through the amygdala, hippocampus, and sort of cutting out the prefrontal cortex to some degree. So we're thinking less, and we're much more emotional. And emotional and sensory information coming in has much more of an effect on our function than it did before. So we may hear things that aren't there. This isn't, I wouldn't go so far as to call it auditory or visual hallucinations, but you may. You may not hear things that were said to you, or you may see things that weren't there. So there are some pretty alarming symptoms, but again, it's not because you've necessarily gone crazy. It's because your brain is trying to protect itself and the function of the whole system, and in doing that, it has modified its sensory and emotional integration system, and there are these changes through this reordering. So of course, this leads to a hypervigilant or hyper-aroused state, right? So because we're sort of kept in a state of stress and alert and hypervigilance, the frustration tolerance, our ability to weather frustration, has been affected greatly because we're already on edge. And of course, as you know from Cipro, if you've studied any of the literature, the research, peer-reviewed clinical research indicates a high probability of, or in many of our cases, GABA receptor damage. So we've also got some structural problems that have been changed, that have been caused by the antibiotic itself, despite the trauma. So we're hyper-vigilant, hyper-aroused. The emotional system is sort of at the forefront of our consciousness. So how does this translate into some daily events or daily behaviors? What does all this mean? Well, it means that your frustration tolerance, as I said, can be greatly reduced. So you get aggravated, or you're more irritable than you used to be as a result of this change in your brain. And it's not really your fault per se. It's that your brain has reordered itself, and this is what happens as a result. These are the things to be on the lookout for, to try to become aware of. Because if these things are resonating, as they have with me, then you may be dealing with post-traumatic stress. And a lot of this can be explained in terms of neuroanatomy and through psychological models rather than just chalking it up to the psychiatric symptoms of the Cipro, which we all are aware of. This event is catastrophic, so these things are happening, and there are different ways to describe the psychiatric outfit after, the event. So frustration tolerance is reduced. A lot of people think, in combat or a car wreck, people are naturally more irritable and hyper aroused when they're back in similar settings or they hear similar noises like firecrackers sound like gunfire. But that's not the case with post-traumatic stress. And in our case, with this being caused by antibiotics, stress triggers are generalized, and they can be generalized into almost anything. So that's a big misconception that people should probably take away from this video. One of the big points, that you can generalize triggers into almost anything, into your human interactions with others, people that you know, people that you don't, into ordinary settings, out in public, at the mall, at the gas station, in traffic. This sort of an event and this rewiring in your brain, you'll carry it with you everywhere you go. And anything that could cause a stress response, things that before didn't even register because our emotional system is kind of back where it belongs. When the emotional system is out front, things that would never have been triggers before in ordinary daily life trigger us, right? So it's generalized all across the board, any setting, home, community, work, in your relationships with others. So be on the lookout for these, and I'll go further into this through the video. When things don't go as we expect them to go, for example, if you're going to be late for something, that could cause, a sudden flare-up of frustration and emotional sort of being overwhelmed. Things that wouldn't have mattered or really rated before, just in ordinary daily events. Things don't go as you expect. You're triggered again. This is mundane, sort of ordinary stimulation. Maybe you're at the drive-through, for lunch, and it's taken a little bit longer than usual, and you may get really, really angry or aggravated, something like that. Why? What the hell? What is taken? Maybe before it would have been a bit frustrating, but now with the reordering, things like that may cause you to get very frustrated and aggressive, or verbally aggressive, or aggressive towards people that are with you, and frustrated because of the reordering of the brain. So this is like an example, I'll repeat, of daily ordinary events that, as a reordered brain assimilates with, we have a different function in than we had previously. So this is a perceived danger. It really is what it comes down to. Any kind of a threat, and you don't get your tacos, it's not really dangerous, but that's not really what I'm getting at. It's any kind of perceived threat or slight that you're not going to get something that you want, right? Or that you're going to have to be around something that you don't, something like that. It doesn't have to be life-changing, but any kind of perceived threat, even slight, can be greatly exaggerated in this condition, right? So especially in interpersonal human relationships, for example, your girlfriend's late for lunch, you don't know what's going on. Before it's no big deal, but now it's like, what is she doing? Is she cheating on me? What's happening? Did she get in a car? All these crazy thoughts, where before you didn't have anything like that. Now all of a sudden, your emotional center is out in the front, kind of calling the shots, right? You hear a lot about flashbacks with this condition. Now for us, we're probably not going to have flashbacks to when we were laying in bed unable to walk, or laying on a hospital gurney trying to figure out, what the hell is going on, although those are horrible memories to have. We get generalized with this antibiotic reaction. Our triggers are generalized really into almost anything. Any more pharmaceuticals, doctors themselves, their treatment can cause fight or flight. Any supplements, or if you have to take another antibiotic again, these are all great triggers to this reordered brain. Lots of foods. Maybe we've got food allergies that we didn't have before. Now there's some validity, of course, to all this, And I'm not taking any of that away from anyone. This seems to affect everyone differently. But because we are in a hyper aroused, hyper vigilant state, we can distort that information and then not take an antibiotic when we really do need it, or think that we're having a reaction to some food that we're not really having. Um, Again, nothing's black and white here. I'm not taking anything away from anyone. I'm just asking you to consider that when you're in fight or flight, if you've had this catastrophic event months and months and months or even years, then your brain has rewired itself, and you may be distorting some of the information coming in as to what is safe for you and what isn't. That's really the whole point. But you'll listen to your own body and figure these things out for yourself, of course. Also, another generalized trigger for us is pain. So, I'm getting better now, but sometimes if I hop out of the car too quickly, I feel a sharp pain or something back in my Achilles. My ankles were hit really bad, my shoulder. So, sudden pain might trigger the pain itself, whereas before, that hurt, no big deal. You just shake it off. It's no big deal. But with this stuff, you know that you are literally disabled and unable to walk. Some of us are severely hurt, or maybe partial tears or ruptures in our tendons. And then, of course, you've read all the stories by now about all the people online that have been horribly affected, their connective tissue in particular, their ankles. This is just an example, but any kind of pain that you get, right? Any kind of pain can suddenly trigger fight or flight, because you suddenly go back, maybe in that moment, to being stuck in bed again, right? You're scared to death. Does this pain, what just happened, or what's going to happen, or how bad will it be 3 hours from now, and then it just starts looping these horrible thoughts, because your emotional center's out front, and you're in fear for generalized triggers because of this condition, right? Meanwhile, you're still around people and in ordinary life, and people, most of us are not around other people face to face that have gone through this. So you may have supportive friends and family around you, but they still don't really know what's going on, and you're kind of in this, nobody really understands, and then you kind of get into this victim mentality, and you don't want to be that way, but you kind of are in a way, even though you're a survivor, and it's a mess, all because you hurt your ankle getting out of the car. So this is an example of the reordered brain trying to function in the ordinary world post event. Generalized triggers, food, other pharmaceuticals, doctors, physical pain in the body, that will constantly keep us hyper aroused, hyper vigilant, the emotion center out front. Our cognition is reduced, our memory is affected, right? We're struggling with frustration tolerance maybe in our relationships. So the stress response system, because of the amygdala out front, is putting us right back in that condition of fight or flight all over again, frequently, right? Maybe multiple times throughout the course of the day, every day. Now, the changes that this has at the personality level, of course, is, anxiety. You appear anxious, irritable, depressed. Maybe you're aggressive where you weren't before. You're angry, or you may become, of course, detached or depersonalized, kind of unplugged from what's going on around you, right? Because in some ways, we don't fit in to the ordinary world as we did before. It's not the same place as it was before to us, and it's because our brain has reordered itself to not be ordinary anymore. It's what's ordinary for that condition, not for what's happening around us, right? Does that make sense? So it ultimately leads to changes in how we see ourselves, right, over the long term. And if it goes untreated, then eventually we'll become burnt out and worn out from the trauma of it. I want to make sure that this is clear with everyone. We've already been through this horrible event, but if we don't realize and address the trauma potential or the reality for many of us and the effect that has on the brain, then we're going to burn ourselves out and wear ourselves out, our mind and our body, through the trauma response itself after being poisoned by Cipro. and it will have an effect on our quality of life. The trauma response, the reordering of the brain, which at that point is the brain's response to the event and no longer something necessarily directly caused by Cipro, you see. So this may result in changes in your routine. You might isolate. You may become more avoidant. You may become more combative with people. You may, the things that used to bring you joy, you may not be able to do anymore. I used to go and run and be out in nature frequently. I loved it. And now those things are almost triggers to me to be, there's a really great state park not far from here, but it's kind of out in the woods, out in the sticks. And I used to go out there frequently. Now, sometimes not so much now at 8 or 9 months, but early on, the idea of going out there and being that far away from everyone and then walking away from the car, maybe half a mile, that would have been a trigger for me. So these were things that used to give me joy, right? So we've got changes in our routines and how we see ourselves, right? The medical symptoms that the further indirect medical results of this can be an increase in strokes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, heart attacks. There's chronic fatigue, ulcers. There can be fluctuations, weight gain or weight loss, all because of that reordering in the brain. This can result in a lot of problems. The trauma. So some of the ways to troubleshoot that, of course, would be exercise if you can, massage, meditation, yoga. You want to reset your breathing and kind of bring your brain back online. This can be treated. The trauma of it can be treated, but first we have to realize that it's happened. And a lot of us really, it took me 6 months to even begin to consider that this was even something, because it's an antibiotic. But this is really what we're dealing with. A lot of us. There is a post-traumatic stress disorder following this event for many of us. Certainly those of us who had severe reactions. So you become wiser. This can ultimately be something turned into a strength once we rewire it back to something more ordinary, because we bring back with us that journey, right, through into the ordinary again, and it can become a very beautiful thing. A flower growing through concrete, right, or a lotus growing up in the mud, right? You've heard those metaphors. So there's something good to come out of this, to become, but we have to get through the journey first, and no one can get through that. No one can do it for us, right? This is something that we have to go through. And a big part of that step, at least for me, is realizing that I have been deeply traumatized by this event. It was a catastrophe. So a few more minutes here. Nightmares, sleep disturbances, some more of the symptoms. You're emotionally aroused. So you may avoid people or settings, as we talked about. Let's go back to some of the translation into daily existence, daily functioning. There's really no threat in the people that love you and care about you. And there's no threat at places like, the gas station or the mall, generally speaking. Just examples, right? But because we're in that hyper-aroused state, there are a lot of triggers and emotional arousal that we are mistakenly attributing to the source, to some other person, or to something said in a conversation, or to a facial expression that is not a threat at all. But the front part of our brain, the rational thinking part, is kind of checked out, and we're emotionally aroused, so we're not processing information like we did before, right? So the amygdala is dumping stress hormones into the body, and it's changing how we process information. Our brain's reordered. It's changed how we process information. When the emotional information, and when we get stuck in that state of fear and anger and frustration, and we don't actually process properly what it all really means, and we don't see the edge of it, then it becomes looped. It becomes like a loop. And then through that loop, this sort of explains the generalized triggers, our response to generalized triggers. We stay constantly aroused through this loop of fear and anger and avoidance, and it's really not consistent with what's happening around us. But it's perfectly normal for the reordered brain. This isn't like it's not something that we're necessarily intentionally doing. It's consistent with the reordered brain, but it's not consistent with the ordinary world, right? So it's never actually processed, this sort of loop response, and we end up, continually experiencing. In some ways, it becomes uh, like a pattern, right, in our thought and our cognition, and then in our behavior, and how we deal with perceived threats that aren't in many cases threats at all. But we have this looped or pattern behavior of dealing with it, which might include aggression or avoidance, or isolation or changes in behavior, right? That we didn't have before, which makes sense for us when it's happening, but it's not actually consistent with what's really happening around us. It's just what's consistent with that reordered brain. So it's chaos, right? We're experiencing a form of, we're staying sort of in a state of chaos. And despite the beauty of our brain and the intricacy of it, our ability to process chaos is actually not so great, because when chaos happens, we reorder our brain to cope with it because it's just too much information to process, right? It's an adaptation. We're really good at bringing in information, but whenever it's too much, we can't keep it in that state of function. It has to be modified. So you go to the mall, what's predictable? This used to be, you go to the mall, for example. There's people walking, there's babies crying, there's music playing, there's people smiling at you, people are maybe speaking to you or approaching you in the stores, people are making eye contact with you, you can smell the food. It's predictable, right? But when we're in settings like this and it's modified, the brain is reordered, and then this typical ordinary stimulation may suddenly become greatly exaggerated, right? Eye contact with a person might suddenly become something that kind of freezes in your brain for a minute, whereas it never would have before, because of the way that we're processing information through that reordered brain. So then these things suddenly become triggers. All these ordinary settings become triggers, generalized into our daily life, on our daily function, right? So this really has often nothing to do with medication at that point, or even Cipro. You've got to put this all together and begin to realize, right? Also in human interaction with people that you love and care about. Some examples, it might be facial expressions when you're just having a conversation with someone. So their facial expression changes, and you're hypersensitive to that, right? Or there's a tone in their voice. Maybe they're having a bad day, or they're frustrated about something that doesn't have anything to do with you. Or it might be the actual words that they're using. If they're maybe aggressive sounding words like crush or smash or kill, they're talking about, oh, he killed it the other day at the basketball game, words like that. But certain words or tones or facial expressions may kind of freeze frame your processing and stick you in an emotional loop of fear or wonder or suspicion. Mistrust is common with this condition because we're not matched up with the ordinary. Through a reordered brain, there's an inconsistency. So we're becoming suspicious of people when there's no reason to be. It's because we realize on some level rationally that something isn't matching up, but what we don't realize is that it's the actual reconfiguration of our own brain, right? That's what's not matching up to what's happening around us, but we can't see its function through it. We can't experience the reconfiguration through the reconfiguration. You've got to start to push through that to become aware of it, right? You've got to become aware that this is happening. And it takes a lot of courage when it's been reordered to do that and to sit with negative emotions. I realize that. It's kind of a catch-22, like a Chinese finger trap. It's a difficult situation. This can have a destructive effect on your relationships, though. It can have a destructive effect on your ability to work, walking through the mall, driving in traffic. It's all perfectly normal for the reordered brain, so I'm compassionate with myself and with others. But this is something that we have to become aware of to work through, because we can, right? So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. We talked about a lot of the symptoms. Maybe you'll just check out, right? Become disassociated, of course, as well. That was another big one. But look into PTSD or complex PTSD, and I hope you folks have a good one, and I'll make another video soon.